it needs to be the right story about what us as producers are doing. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my operation as Peter gets my presentation up. Our ranch is located right outside the city of Bismarck. We get about 16 inches of total precip per year. Of that, about 9 or 10 inches is rainfall. The remainder is snow. So snow is a big part of our moisture for the year. We have 5,000 acres now in our operation. We're actually shrinking the size of it. We did have about 6,000 acres of owned and rented land, but as we've started to vertically stack enterprises, we're shrinking the size because we simply don't need that many acres to support our families. All the work is done by myself, my wife, and our son Paul. We have about 2,000 acres of true native rangeland, which has never been broke up. We have another about 1,000 acres of tame grass native pastures, and then about 2,000 acres of cropland. And I'll get into that a little bit more. So one of the things, I've been out speaking for about the past 10 years about our operation, and what really got me interested in soil health was a series of events in the mid-90s. We lost 4 crops in a row to hail and drought. And the banker wouldn't loan me any money for synthetic inputs. I was fortunate, he didn't foreclose on me, but I had to learn, how do I make this land productive without going out and writing checks for it? So, as I said in the film, those 4 years were the best thing that could have ever happened to my family. It was hell to go through at the time, and I know a lot of you are experiencing the same thing with the drought you've had down here. But I tell you, you can come out of it with a much better production model. And this is my story. I noticed early on that we were starting to have a loss of the soil resource. I took this photo here. This is my neighbor's land, and I can talk about him. He's not here today. So he had seeded spring wheat, and then we had a windstorm, and that's his field right behind me there, and I'm standing in the ditch. And that's his wheat crop. He lost all his topsoil. I was just fortunate it was an east wind and a lot of it ended up on my place. But no matter where I travel, and I've traveled all throughout North America and into Australia, I tend to see the same thing. This was in our own county a few years back. That's the top wire on a 3-wire barbed wire fence I'm pointing to. That's how much those ditches had filled in with soil. Last June for Father's Day, there was a tour, and it was a soil health tour. And my son said, for Father's Day, Dad, I'm going to take you on this soil health tour. And we toured one of the premier organic operations in North America, and this is what we saw. Well, needless to say, I didn't think much of the soil health on that tour. And no matter where we go, I tend to see the same thing. We're seeing a loss of our resource. And if you do as much travel by air as I do, you tend to see this quite a bit during the spring and summer. Our soil is ending up into streams, then rivers, and eventually into the Gulf. I just thought this is a pretty dramatic photo. If that doesn't show, now there's a lot of tragedy, of course, with this, with the floods that occurred a few years back, but think of the amount of soil that was lost in those floods that the middle part of the country saw a few years ago. Traveling through Nebraska, took this photo. Well, when you start seeing soil piled up like snowdrifts on the roadway, you know you have issues. Just because we're no-tillers does not mean we have good soil health. Here's a no-till operation. To me, that's a travesty. Anytime we do tillage, we're going to have erosion, and we're going to lose our soil resource. Unfortunately, a lot of that is occurring right here in eastern Colorado. That photo was just last month, and I realized that a big part of that is due to nature and a lack of rainfall. But there's things we can do as producers to mitigate that. My friend Ray Archuleta put this slide together, and I really like it. It says it's a disrupted soil ecosystem. The soil is naked, hungry, thirsty, and running a fever. Every time I see a bare soil, I think of that photo because that's what it is. How are we feeding that life in the soil? Back home in North Dakota and in much of the country here with corn prices, commodity prices the way they've been, we're unfortunately seeing a lot of this. The top photo is land that was in CRP being taken out. The bottom photos are native rangeland that's being put back into crop production. And I honestly believe the good Lord did not intend all land to be farmed. You know, look at the amount of rocks on that particular field. I mean, I don't have that much ambition. Now, Ken Miller, who's down here with me, and I hope all of you heard his presentation, him and I were traveling in Australia here 2 years ago, and we about locked the brakes up on the vehicle when we saw this field. Now, if you look closely, that is seeded. There's oats growing in that field. Now, how would you like to run over that? We had the good fortune in meeting this producer, and he says, but just realize, I already had the rocks picked. Look in the upper right. There's a rock pile there. So he actually did send me photos of that oat field then in the fall, and he combined oats off this field. That just blew our mind. Couldn't imagine that. The other thing I tend to see as I travel around is just monocultures. You know, what are the crops we're seeing in the United States? The majority, of course, are corn, soybeans, and wheat. But they're monocultures. I've come to realize that monocultures are a detriment to soil health. Where in nature do you find monocultures? Very seldom. Case in point in that is, look at this soil. This is the same soil. This farmer had a forested area. He cleared part of it out, seeded soybean monoculture for 17 years. That's the same soil. It went from 4.3% organic matter down to 1.6%. I took over when we bought our operation. It had been in the family since 1956. My father-in-law farmed it, half summer fallow, half crop, all small grains for 35 years. All cool season monocultures. That soil on the right is pretty much what my soil looked like when I started. The first year I started farming that ground, we took soil tests. We were from 1.7 to 1.9% on our fields. I tell people I could never go fishing because we never found an earthworm on any of the fields for years. So what are the consequences of all this soil loss? The consequences to us as producers is we're seeing ever-increasing input costs. Whether it be synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, fuel, labor. The organic producers, they're having to use more and more fuel and labor, put on manure, other amendments to get the same amount of production. The conventional paradigm, and the one that I was in for many years, was it seemed whenever I got up in the morning, I was just trying to figure out, what am I going to kill that day? Am I going to kill a weed? Am I going to kill a pest? What am I going to do? Is it a fungal disease I got to kill, take care of? But that's all my mindset was back then. And the organic producers, their fallacy, although organic may be less bad, they still have a negative impact on the soil resource, the water resource, nutrient cycling, and they may or may not be producing nutrient-dense foods. I really get tired of hearing the sales pitch that just because it's organic, it's healthy. No, that isn't necessarily true. Here's proof that our current production model is not working in my mind. The United States is now the 42nd healthiest country in the world. Think about that. We're the most well-fed country, but we're the 42nd least healthiest country in the world. We're first in chronic degenerative diseases, first in all autoimmune diseases, first in cancer, first in osteoporosis, first in obesity. We must remember, as producers, we're in the business to produce nutrition. We're not producing commodities, we're producing nutrition. The nutrient density of the foods that we've produced has decreased anywhere from 15 to 65% in the last 25 plus years. Now, obviously that's not all to be blamed on producers, but we as producers need to accept our fair share of the blame. And I think a lot of that blame has to do with what we've done to the resource. We're hearing all this hype today about sustainability. We got to be sustainable. Why in the world would we want to sustain a degraded resource? I'm sick and tired of that word, sustainability. We got to start thinking about regeneration. We have to start building our soil resources back so that we can produce the kind of nutrition it takes for a healthy world. So how do we regenerate our resources? I found the answer in native range. Go out and take a look at healthy native rangeland. This is a photo of a piece of rangeland that I bought in 2002. There's two reasons I bought this land. One is because with that amount of rocks, I'd never be tempted to break it up, you know. But the other is, it had a great amount of true native diversity. My son teaches range management at the local community college. He brought his students out there, and in this paddock, over a 2-hour period, they counted over 140 different species of grasses, forbs, and legumes. That's diversity. Now, if our prairie soils were formed with that kind of plant community and that kind of diversity, why don't we have that? I'm going to show you a series of slides here which emphasize the importance of diversity. Now, I'm fortunate that being from Burley County, North Dakota, our soil conservation district has done a lot of work. And you met Jay Fear, our district conservationist. Ken Miller, who's here, works part-time for the district. In 2006, in January, Jay and I traveled to No-Till on the Plains in Salina, Kansas. And we listened to Dr. Ademir Caligari from Brazil, who was giving a presentation. And at that time, we were doing quite a bit of cover cropping, but it was just 2- and 3-way mixes. Well, Dr. Caligari was talking about diverse mixes, 7 and 8 different species. Jay and I knew the minute we heard that that's the next step in building soil health. So we went back to Burley County then, and that spring, we decided to do some plot work, some trials. So we had a very open winter, and like I said earlier, snow is a big part of our moisture. So we didn't have any subsoil moisture. In late May, we went into the plots and we seeded monocultures. We seeded turnips, radish, Sudan grass, etc., all as monocultures. And in the last plot, we mixed all the seed together. Well, what happened then, seeded in late May, and by the time these photos were taken in late July, we had less than 1 inch of moisture, rainfall. So you can see the turnip monoculture was pretty well dried up. Right next to it was the radish, pretty well dried up. And so it went on down the line until you got to that diverse mix. It is a fallacy to think in our minds that crops compete against each other, that these plants compete against each other. That's not the way nature works. If that was the case, why do we see such diversity in nature? Now, the district team, they clip those plots and weighed them. Look at, that's on a dry matter basis, we over tripled production in that drought by planting a polyculture versus a monoculture. Dr. Chris Nichols, many of you know her. She's a world-famous microbiologist. She said it this way, and I really think it summed it up well. She's talking about mycorrhizal fungi, and if you haven't heard Dr. Taheri, please go listen to her this morning. Not only do the fungi provide for the needs of one plant, but the fungal hyphae pipeline connect to multiple plants. This helps satisfy the nutritional and energy needs of both microorganisms and the plants. There's a whole host of things happening in that soil that we don't begin to understand. But I ask you this, who's been around longer? Nature for eons of time, or us trying to force our monoculture practices on it? So, where's the diversity? That's the whole point of this. Why are we trying to impose our will on nature? Nature's going to win every time. I have this newspaper from 1871, and I scanned it and put it on here. It shows the bison and with the wolves following them. And when you really get thinking about soils, how are our prairie soils formed? Large herds, bison, elk, etc. Plus we had the wolves and coyotes, we had rabbits. Greatest numbered herbivore on the plains was the grasshopper. We had a lot of diversity on the plains in animals. Where are the fences? Where are the animals today? I mean, I can drive for hundreds of miles now without seeing a fence. They were an important part of the ecosystem, but we took them out of it. It's the diversity that drives soil health. We've taken that out of our ecosystem. So what I've learned over the past 20 plus years, these are what I consider my key points in achieving a healthy soil. Number one is the least amount of disturbance possible. Okay? Second, we need plant diversity. And by that I don't just mean a diverse species mix. I mean different leaf shapes and sizes, different rooting depths. We need the whole plant community. We need armor on the soil surface. That soil surface has to be protected to keep temperatures down, to prevent erosion, to prevent evaporation, transpiration. Fourth thing, we need a living root in the ground as long as possible. I used to think in my environment we get our last killing frost between the 10th and 15th of May, and our first one in the fall between 10th, 15th of September. I used to think that short window of time was all the longer I could grow a crop. Walk out on the native prairie. There's species growing there in March, April. There's species growing there in October, November, even in North Dakota. It's amazing. We need to lengthen the amount of time we have a living root in the soil. I saw this bumper sticker. It's put on this tillage equipment. Tillage promotes a safer environment for tomorrow. I didn't like that one too much, so we got to do away with that one. In 1993, I had a good friend of mine from the northern part of North Dakota who was a no-till. And I thought at that time that moisture was my limiting factor. And he says, Gabe, you need to go to no-till. You'll save time, you'll save moisture. But he said, I'm going to give you a little advice. If you go no-till, sell all your tillage equipment. Then you won't be tempted to go back. And I actually did that. We sold all of our tillage equipment and bought this no-till drill. And we've been 100% no-till since 1993. Now, realize what I'm presenting to you today, I'm in no way trying to tell you this is how you should or shouldn't run your operation. That's up for each of you as producers to decide. All I'm doing is sharing my experiences. And don't pay any attention to the species that I'm planting. They may or may not work in your operation. Only you can determine that. All I'm trying to impose on you is the concept that we've followed. Notice here the diversity I have. These are just the cash crops we grew on those 2,000 acres this past year. And notice there's some species of all four crop types. Warm and cool season broadleaves and grasses. I'm trying to diversify. I mentioned earlier when I took over that operation, my father-in-law, all he planted was cool season grasses, spring wheat, oats, barley. That's all that land had seen for 35 years. We needed to diversify. We needed to feed that soil life a diverse diet. Now what we've evolved into is we no longer plant monocultures. We always try to have diversity even in the cash crops. On our 2,000 acres of cropland, we try and get cover crops on all 2,000 acres every year. Now that may be before a cash crop, along with a cash crop, or after a cash crop. We try to have a cover crop growing at all times. So what we've done, for instance, in the upper left, that's oats along with 3 types of clover. The lower left, that's corn along with hairy vetch clover. Lower right is sunflowers, and there's about 20 different species in there. And in the upper right, that's a cool season broadleaf forage polyculture. This is just a photo of oats field from last year. Obviously, we're using no post-emergent herbicide. We have not used any synthetic fertilizers of any kind since 2008, and we've used no pesticides or fungicides since before the turn of the century. There's the 3 types of clover growing underneath. We no-tilled this into the previous year's corn residue, and then we seeded the legumes at the same time. We straight combine it off, and then that clover continues to grow after harvest. This is corn, and in our drier environment, what we're doing now is we're going out and we're seeding our cover crops the day before we plant the corn. I'm trying to get it down with a different planter where I can do it all in one pass. But the beauty of this type of system is we don't need herbicides. We got ground cover as soon as those legumes come up, and those legumes come up, prohibit weed growth, and then they're also feeding that corn the nitrogen it needs. And then the beauty of it is in the winter we can convert it to dollars, because our cattle will go down. That vetch is still 18+% protein in the winter. They've got a balanced diet. Don't have to worry about putting up as much forage. How do you integrate cover crops into the system? What you do is you design them for what you do not have. What don't you have in your system that cover crops could provide? Is it diversity? Is it armor on the soil surface? Is it to improve organic matter? Is it to improve infiltration? That's only something you can decide. But before you go out and plant a cover crop, you got to decide what's your resource concern, and then what don't I have that I can address with cover crops. These are just a few of the cover crops we planted last year. We actually used over 70 species of cover crops in 2013. Now, not all of them are mixed together. Most of the combinations I'm using are from 15 to 25 species. We've gone as high as 70 species in one mix. But don't pay attention to the species. Just realize there are cover crops out there that'll grow in any environment. Dr. Caligari has since been to North Dakota, and we spent some time with him, and I'll never forget one thing he told me. He's the world's foremost authority on cover crops. He's worked in over 65 different countries all over the world. And he says, Gabe, you give me 2 inches of rainfall a year, or 200, anywhere in between there, I will get you cover crops grown. Because there's species in this world that can do it. The other thing is you need to figure out, when do I have a gap in my production? Now, I spent a lot of time speaking to corn soybean farmers, and I tell them you have to expand your mind. If you only want to grow corn and soybeans, you're not going to be able to advance soil health very far. You know, you need to have those windows of time that you can fill with the cover crop. One of the easiest ways for us in our environment is with the fall-seeded biennials. This is a combination of forage winter wheat, winter pea, hairy vetch, radish, and I also had some canola in there. I really like these fall-seeded biennials because they give us a lot of different options. This is winter triticale, hairy vetch, sweet clover, radish. Now obviously in our environment the radish will winter kill, but the other crops do real well. We've been planting winter triticale since the mid-90s. I've only had it winter kill once. Hairy vetch has never winter killed in my environment. But it leaves us a lot of options. We can combine it. We really like to calve out on these winter biennials. We used to calve in February and March. We now calve from May 15th through late June. They calve 2 miles from the nearest corral. It's an absolute no-brainer for us to calve out on them. We can always also graze stockers or yearling cattle on there. We also do some grass finishing. Works extremely well. Our gains average over 2 pounds a day on it. You can get multiple grazings off it if your grazing management is good with rest and recovery. There's very high nutrient density to it. If our resource concern is a lack of armor on the soil surface, we will let this winter's biennials get to a higher carbon state, and then we will mob graze. We use mob grazing as a tool. We use cover crops as a tool. No-till as a tool. These are all just tools that you use to improve the resource and put dollars in your pocket. Here, that group of heifers, there was about 685,000 pounds of beef equivalent per acre there, and they're moving. We use those bat latches like you saw Neil use in the movie. And that's what it looks like when we're done. Obviously, if you want the highest rate of gain on the cattle, you're not going to let your cover crop get to this state. But our resource concern was armor on the surface. So we let it get more mature, and then in a matter of a couple days, it'll look like that. It will be terminated by the livestock grazing. And we'll continue regeneration by putting another diverse cover crop mix onto that land. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that we're growing these full season of cover crops on all our acres. About 1,800 of those 2,000 acres every year are cash crops. There's about 200 of them that get grazed like this. Now those other 1,800 acres that are cash crops are still going to have cover crops every year, but they're not going to be mob grazed during the growing season. When we go in the warm time of year, you have to put in species that'll survive that heat. So we use predominantly warm seasons in that mix. Mainly sunflowers, Sudan grass, cowpeas, soybeans, etc. And that's what the very diverse mix looks like. People often ask me, isn't there a problem seeding this with the different seed size? It's no problem. Put it in the ground, it'll grow. This is 5 days later, and it's already germinating. But look at the residue on that soil surface. We don't have to apply a herbicide. There's not going to be weeds coming up through that. That winter triticale vetch outcompeted any weeds that were coming. There the residue is buffering our heat. We can get fairly hot in August, not as hot as eastern Colorado, but we can get fairly hot, and that residue keeps soil temperatures lower. We like to call it biological primification, because what we're really doing with our cover crops is we're feeding that life in the soil. We're also feeding the whole ecosystem. I hope you all had a chance to listen to Dr. Lundgren. The work he's doing with insects is absolutely amazing. I mentioned earlier, we haven't had to use an insecticide since before the turn of the century. We have enough predator insects and pollinators. This photo here was actually taken in October. Now, we had many killing frosts before then, but you can get these cold-tolerant species that'll keep growing. There's pollinators on our land working in October in North Dakota. You have to provide the home. And then the predator species, these are lady beetles. There's different stages of their life, and they're out there feeding on all the pests. Yes, we do have some pests on some of our cropland fields, but no, they never reach the point where they harm us economically, because we have all these predator insects taking care of them. But you have to provide the home first. Look at that photo. How many flies are going to get through that web and be a nuisance to our cattle when you have that type of a spider population in your pastures? Sun took that on a dewy morning. The most important insects, though, are the life that's in the soil. All that soil biology that Dr. Clapperton talked about. That's what we really want to feed. And you heard her say there's more microorganisms in a teaspoonful of healthy soil than there are people on this world. That's one of our greatest challenges now, is feeding that life in the soil so it can sustain the plant life. Now, we let those cover crops grow, those warm season covers, and they provide us a lot of different options also. One of the things we can do is we can grass finish some cattle on them, or if you run yearlings, you can do that. You get very high rates of gain, 2.5 pounds plus in many cases if you have the C4 grasses in there. Or you can let it go. This photo was taken right before a killing frost. This next one is that same field right after a killing frost, but notice the brassicas, many of the plant species are still green and growing. And this is how we convert the majority of our cover crops into dollars, immediate dollars. And that's by letting cows be cows. We have really cut back on the cost of running a cow a year by grazing our cattle on cover crops throughout the winter. You gotta allow livestock to do what they do best. And it can get really cold and ugly up in North Dakota. I mean beautiful, excuse me, it's really nice. But when you graze these covers during the winter, you have to use the same type of management that you use in the summer. This is the amount of residue we like left. You know, a good rule of thumb we use is 1/3 for the critters above ground, 2/3 for those below ground. This amount of residue is key for many reasons. It provides armor on the soil surface to protect that soil. It reduces evaporation. It reduces weed pressure. And it also feeds macroorganisms. Now I'm going to show you one of what I think is one of the fallacies of the current production model. Okay, you saw this field here. We took a soil test. I know it's too far away for you to read that. but what that shows, there's 10 units of nitrogen available in the top 2 feet of the soil profile. How many bushel of corn can you grow on that? If my local agronomist who took this test, you know, I told him I was going to corn in that field the next year, and he says, well, you know, Gabe, your yield's about 125 bushels. You need to put on about 115, 120 bushels of pounds of N on that field. Well, I'll show you what I did. We went directly in there, and we planted right into that residue. When I say I'm a no-tiller, I'm a no-tiller. No row markers, no trash whippers. On the left is planted already, on the right is not. This is what that field looked like later in the year. Now, no synthetic fertilizer, on this particular field, we did do a burn down. It got a little late on us, and we did have a flush of the millet that had went to seed in the previous year's cover crop. So I did do a pre-plant burn down with the grass herbicide, not glyphosate though. Ray Ward was at my place, and he actually took this test. I hope you had a chance to listen to him. This is the leaf tissue analysis from that cornfield at tasseling time. Every nutrient tested for was satisfactory or above. Where did it come from? I never applied anything. That corn yielded 142 bushels an acre. Our county average is right at about 100. My proven dryland yield is 127 without inputs. Where it came from was the life in the soil. Our soils are alive if our management allows them to be. This is a photo of the cover crop late in the year. We brushed aside the residue. What that's showing, that's solid earthworm castings. I mentioned that early on when we bought that land, I could never go fishing because no earthworms. Past spring we did earthworm counts, and we took it in a 1 foot by 1 foot area, 2 inches deep, and we were averaging over 60. That's a lot of earthworms. That's producing a lot of fertility for us. And they came on their own. I didn't transplant any there. This is Dr. Clapperton's PLFA test. I'm not near smart enough. All I know is there's a tremendous amount of diversity there. And it shows the predator and the prey relationship and all the different bacteria and protozoa. All those different organisms that are in the soil. You'll have to ask her to explain that test. A new test, and I hope you have a chance to listen to Dr. Ward talk about the Haney test. I really think this is a test that every producer needs to be using. Dr. Rick Haney, researcher at Temple, Texas, developed this test. It's the first test I've seen that really takes into account all 3 properties in the soil, the chemical, the physical, and the biological, because he's not only testing the organic matter, which is the home for all of this biology, but it's testing the water extractable carbon, which is the food for the biology. And it also tests Savita and several other things. And he puts all those together, and he's able to show you in a pie chart like this, both the organic fraction that's in the soil and the inorganic. And it's that organic fraction that's being converted into inorganic forms for our plants to use. But it's the biology that's going to do that. This is a good example of why we can't just be satisfied with being no-tillers. This is the Haney data that was taken off of 2 of my fields. Now, the red bars there are a field that I was there in the spring of 1983 when that land was seeded to alfalfa, that particular field. It was still in alfalfa when I bought that property in 91. And in 93, when I started no-tilling, I terminated that alfalfa with a herbicide and then no-tilled it. So it's been no-till for 30 years. The green bars are the field directly adjacent to that one. And that particular field has been no-till since 1993. Both those fields have been in a cover crop, cash crop rotation. So they've had the same species growing on them for the past 20 years since I bought the place. The only difference is the green barred field I mob grazed with livestock 2 years out of the past 6. Now, part of that, it wasn't a full summer, it was just late in the year. But it's had livestock integration where the red field had no livestock integration. On your far left, that's showing nitrogen, and it shows 86 to 90 pounds. No significant difference in nitrogen. But look at phosphorus. We went from 65 pounds without livestock to 239 pounds with livestock. What that's showing us is that by integrating livestock back onto the land, we're taking more of that organic fraction of phosphorus, converting it to inorganic, making it available for the plants. That shows the importance of getting livestock back out on the land. Third bar, that's potassium, same thing. We went from 429 to 595. Now, of that 2,000 acres of cropland I have, there's about 400 acres that I can't graze livestock on. There's housing developments around it, no water on it. Our soil health on those acres will never be to the point that it is where we can graze livestock. But think of how our prairie soils were formed. All those herds of migrating animals. Diversity, diversity, diversity. My son took this photo one day when he was out moving our cattle. That's our cattle in the foreground, that's our neighbor in the background. Which is going to put more dollars in your pocket. This is my actual income and expense for my entire corn crop in 2012. I figured it out, and we did have a few fields we used to pre-plant herbicide on. There was crop insurance. We have since bowed out of the crop insurance program. I'm going to get kicked out anyway with all the intercropping I do, and I haven't had to use it for a while, so that's no longer applicable. But the important thing there is look at that bottom line. It cost me $1.44 a bushel to get a bushel of corn to market. That includes land costs, trucking, everything. Corn can drop to $2. I can still make money. Not as much, but I can still make money. I was in Illinois speaking in January, and I had a banker come up to me when I was done, and he said, Gabe, do you realize if corn drops below $5, half my borrowers are not going to be able to make their payments? This was a year ago, and I said to him, well, that's pretty likely to happen. He said, I know, that's why I don't sleep at night. This is the trend in organic matter. I mentioned we started at 1.7 to 1.9. In July when we tested those same fields, we're from 5.3 to 6.1 now. But I'm still degraded. That's not good enough. My native rangeland is testing from 7.3 to 8. I'm still degraded. So I get really tired of people saying they want to be sustainable. Don't sustain a degraded resource. We need to regenerate. What's the value of organic matter? And this is in simple terms. You just do the math. And for NP, K, and sulfur, I figured it out. For every 1% increase in organic matter, I was adding about $640 worth of nutrients. So my 6% organic matter soils are worth about $3,840 just for the NP, K, and sulfur. There's a lot of money that we're missing out on because we're not taking advantage of the power of the soil. How about water holding capacity? And this is especially important for those in drier areas such as yourself. That middle column there, silt loam, is where my soils are at. When I started out, I was under 2% organic matter. In other words, I can only hold about 8-9 inches in the top 4 feet of the soil profile. Now today I'm well above 5%. I can hold 20 inches. You know? In other words, every raindrop that falls, as long as I have armor and protection, infiltration, it's going to go in that soil and it's going to be stored. Some things don't make sense, and this was alluded to in the movie, and I can talk about my neighbor again because he's not here. I've been on that farm for 30 years. Every fall, my neighbor goes out and he discs that low spot, digs it up, every fall. He's maybe missed once in the last 30 years. I don't remember him missing, but every fall he does that. This photo I took off the front deck of my house on June 15, 2009. Our weather service was calling for a major rainfall event, which usually meant about 20 hundredths, but no. They were saying we were going to get a couple inches of rain. Well, it started raining at 6:30 in the evening. By midnight, we had 12.2 inches. During the night, we got another 1.4. We ended up with 13.6 inches of rainfall. Jay Fear, who's here today, he can attest to this because he took this photo. That's my farmstead up on the top. That's a slope coming down. That's my field after 13.6 inches of rain. We lost a little residue, but the important thing is that's what the soil looked like. Jay took that picture, he dug up the soil and took that picture. Notice that soil structure? I didn't infiltrate it all back then, but we infiltrated a great part of it. 3 weeks later, that was the neighbor's field, and that field actually sits higher up than mine. It's right across the road. Every year it happens. He'll get the crop seeded in there. Every year we'll get a rain. Because of that tillage, he sealed off all those infiltration pores. This is what happens. And I can't figure it out because he's not a duck hunter. I don't know why you do that. Peter had this in the movie about how we've been able to increase infiltration. That's the key. You know, we went from 1/2 inch per hour to now we're over 8 inches. Soil carbon is the key driver for the nutritional status of plants, and therefore the mineral density to animals and people. Soil carbon is a key driver for moisture holding capacity, which is frequently the most limiting factor in production. In other words, folks, soil carbon is the key driver for profit. We have to start talking in terms of carbon. One of the ways we're doing that on our operation is we've now gone to, and we've started seeding cropland acres back to perennial native species of grasses, because they can sequester more carbon than can our annuals. That's proven. So we're trying to get back to the system that does that. Now, how long we'll keep it in those native species, that remains to be seen, but we have to add them back to the system. The other thing we're doing, my son who's 27, he went to college, got 3 degrees, and he hated it, but I made him go to college just to get him out of the house, because then I could lock the doors. No, I'm kidding. But I challenged him. I knew he was going to come back and take over the ranch. I said, if you do that, you can come back, but you have to be able to expand the operation, and I do not mean horizontally. I said, you have to think and expand your thinking. Well, he called me while he was in college, and he said, you know, Dad, you talk about all this diversity of livestock. We don't have a lot of, all this diversity that was on the plains, we don't have a lot of diversity of livestock. So he wanted to get sheep. Well, I had stuck my foot in my mouth then, so it's kind of like, what could I do? So now we got a flock of sheep, and I tell everybody they're on a planned grazing system. Wherever they plan on going, that's where they go. Learn the hard way about sheep. He also has an egg business. This is one of his egg mobiles. He pulls them around in the cover crops, and I could never figure out, you know, why a single 25-year-old guy at the time would want to put up with chickens and sell eggs, until I followed and went with him one evening, because every week he goes into a park in town on Wednesday evening, and then about 100 young ladies flock around him to buy those eggs, and then I understood. Yeah, it made me proud that night. He also has broilers, and this is one of his first broiler mobile he made, and he has several of them now. You know, I'm not finicky about us having weeds in our cash grain. It doesn't bother us, because we just run it through a quick cleaner. Paul takes those screenings, converts it to $5 a pound protein. He gets $5 a pound for these chickens. They're all sold before we even harvest them. They are the most profitable enterprise on the operation for the input put in. Here's just some of the enterprises we'd be able to have on our operation. And we don't have all these to date, but we're getting them. I've been informed that the hogs have been bought, and the forage pigs will be on the operation this spring. But all I'm trying to do is show you here that if you're a corn bean farmer, boy, what are your options? You sell corn or beans. On our operation, I no longer pay much attention to commodity prices, because it doesn't matter in our operation. We have so many different income streams, they're all just a small part. That's why I don't carry crop insurance anymore. For one reason, I think it's welfare, so I just refuse to take part in it anymore. The other thing, though, is if I have a hailstorm, I just turn some livestock on there to harvest. We have so many different income streams, it's relatively simple to make money nowadays. This is what we've done in the past 20 years on our operation. We started with that shallow, light-colored topsoil. We started no-tilling in '93. We really diversified the cash crop rotation in '95. We started seeing our organic matter levels increase. '97, we integrated cover crops a lot more on most of the acres, saw another bump in the organic matter levels. 2006, after hearing Dr. Caligari, we went to the polyculture cover crops, saw another significantly bump in organic matter. Then in 2010, well, we actually started a few years before that, but we really started integrating the livestock and getting different species, and we noticed an increase in our organic matter levels then. We now have a plot of land that we've been working on that here in July it tested 11.1% organic matter. It's our goal to take that field scale this year. You know, obviously it's going to take us a few years to get that field up to that percent organic matter. But my son gave a presentation at a conference and he stood in front of everybody and said one of his goals is in his lifetime he wants to see all of our land over 12% organic matter. And I think he'll be able to do it. This is what our soil looks like now. We've gone from a very shallow topsoil to about 14 inches now of rich, dark cottage cheese looking topsoil. You can make a difference in your land. And I wish I would have known back in '93 what I know now, because I could have advanced it at a much faster rate. Paul put this inverted triangle together, and I think it sums up our operation really well. At the bottom, when I started out, I was doing tillage, and I was degrading the system. I was releasing carbon, and I was input driven. Then we went no-till. That wasn't good enough. We were still in a degrading state. Then we started to diversify different cash crops. Got better. Then when we started to integrate the cover crops and add livestock, that's when we really started regenerating our soils. And now we're sequestering carbon and we're biologically driven. You know, we have a motto on our operation. We want to sign the back of the check and not the front. Think about that one. Ken, did you get that, Ken? Oh, okay. This is what it's about, though. If you have healthy soil, you're going to have clean water, healthy plants, healthy animals, healthy people. That's what it's about, but everything starts with the soil. We can't just think of the soil as a medium to hold the plant upright. We have to start thinking of it as a living ecosystem, because if we do, then we can really drive profitability. Then we can work towards sustainability. Wendell Berry said this, and I'm going to read it to you because I think it's worth repeating. Soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. It is the healer and restorer and resurrector, by which disease passes into health, age into youth, death into life. Without proper care for it, we can have no community, because without proper care for it, we can have no life. All of our life depends on the life of the soil. I challenge you with this. What's your legacy going to be? One of my greatest fears is for one of my grandchildren to come up to me and say, Grandpa, why didn't you do something about that? You knew we were degrading the resource. You knew you were leaving it in a poorer state for our generation. Why didn't you do something about it? That's my challenge to you. I'm going to take question and answers at the session at noon at the break, so if you have questions, I think our time is up. We got to get moving, but I'll be happy to answer them now. Thank you.